Hello, my name is Tom Beer. The popular opinion these days amongst Bible scholars is that we cannot know for sure every single word of the New Testament. Well, contrary to that opinion, I believe God has preserved each and every word, and we can know them. Psalm 12, verses 6 and 7. The words of the Lord are pure words, like silver tried in a furnace of earth, purified 7 times. You shall keep them, O Lord. You shall preserve them from this generation forever. So, even if this seminar does not sway you fully, I hope that it will at least cause you to consider the possibility that God has indeed preserved each and every word of the New Testament as it was written in Greek. So, should we believe this verse or not? Did God preserve his words, or did he preserve them for the most part? It seems to me inconsistent with God's nature that he would only just preserve it in part and not every single word. Is he not able? Did he not care enough? I believe that he's definitely able and that he definitely cares. I remember when I was a new believer, I got my first New American Standard Bible, and I was shocked to read in the notes. There'd be question about whether or not certain passages were even in the Bible, certain verses, or there was uncertainty about what verses actually said when they were originally written. And I thought to myself, surely God would not allow his word to get corrupted. It just didn't sit well with me. Yet most scholars today will tell you that we don't know every word, and they seem content with that. Well, one of their recognized scholar has said, it's generally recognized that the original text of the Bible cannot be recovered. Well, in the 1970s, later in the 1970s, I went to Bible college, and they taught me that for the most part, God has preserved his word. And I accepted that. But recently I've been studying, and the more I study, the more I believe that they were wrong. So this seminar provides evidence that shows that God has indeed preserved each and every word of the New Testament as it was written in the Greek. Now, most of what I want to get to is that evidence, but to grasp that evidence fully, we have to have an understanding of the history that brought us to where we are today. So in the first part of this seminar, we're going to talk about that history. But in the second half is when we're going to talk about the evidence. First of all, I will show why the current popular thinking is flawed. And I will call the product of that thinking the critical text. That's the critical Greek text. Then after that, I'll provide evidence that shows that God has preserved each word. And in that context, I'll be talking about the majority text. I'll explain what these terms mean later. So there are some historical realities that we have to consider. In Galatians 4:4, it says that in the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son. That means that he had been preparing things. And one of those things that he had prepared was the advent of the Greek language. See, the New Testament was written in Greek. That was God's choice, obviously. So later, though, in around 200 AD, the New Testament had been translated into Old Latin. And it was, Latin was also being spoken around the world, especially in the western part of the world, the known world at that time. So that by the time 300 AD rolls along, the Christians in, say, Rome and North Africa, they did not speak Greek anymore. They spoke Latin. However, a good part of the world, a large part of it, continued to speak Greek. Now the Near East and Greece, East Mediterranean area, the Christians spoke mainly in Greek. And they continued to speak that Greek all the way up until the mid-15th century. And this part of the world became known as the Byzantine Empire. Providentially, I think it's noteworthy that by the time that this empire collapsed, the printing press was invented. And I do believe that there's a tie-in with that to the story that we're going to be looking at here today. So the most important thing, though, having to do with this particular slide is that the Christians in the East, now we might refer to them nowadays as the Eastern Orthodox Church. I don't think they called themselves that back then. It was the Greek-speaking part of the world. And those churches, they used the Greek New Testament as their scriptures, whereas the people in the West, they were using Latin scriptures. So here's a depiction of that empire. In red, you have the areas where the people continued to speak Greek up until the mid-15th century, whereas in the other parts of the Christian world, people were using Latin, and they did not guard the Greek New Testament. Now, we have today many manuscripts that you can actually see if you go to the right place. These manuscripts, there's over 5,000 of them, and they exist in various sizes. A few of them are very, very old. They date back to before 500 AD, but most of these manuscripts were created since then. Some of them are complete New Testaments, but many are just portions of the New Testament. Many are contiguous verses, whereas some of these documents are just people quoting from a portion, or just say a few verses of the New Testament. So all of that, though, makes up this 5,000. It's quite a variety of different documents. But none of the original documents exist. I'll call those here autographs. The ones that Peter, Paul, etc., they wrote, they no longer exist. The important thing concerning this discussion here is that when you look at all 5,000 manuscripts, you're going to find that they don't always agree. And that's the nature of the problem. So what do these manuscripts look like anyway? Well, the earliest ones used all capital letters, Greek capital letters. Ones that were made later used mainly lowercase letters. Many of these manuscripts can now be viewed as digital documents. At the bottom of this web page, there are a bunch of links. One of them is to this website shown here, where you can actually look at a lot of these manuscripts digitally. This is a timeline of various manuscripts when they were produced, made. The first one we have is from about 100 AD. It's P52. It's a fragment of John. It's less than a page. It's papyrus. By 250 AD, these P45, 46, 47, etc. were made. And if you combine them all, you have pretty much most of the New Testament. By 350 AD, we have, in particular, Aleph and B, the two most critical manuscripts for the critical text camp. They'll talk as if they consider all of these manuscripts mentioned here, including these old papyrus ones, but in reality, Aleph and B are their go-to. And these documents, Aleph and B, contain not only most of the New Testament, but also the Old Testament in Greek, as well as the Apocrypha. So they're pretty thick documents. Now, by 450 AD, there were some other pretty good size documents, most of the New Testament in A and D. But the Byzantine manuscripts from the Greek-speaking part of the world, they were dated much later, 800 AD and so on. But they do have archetypes dating back even to the 2nd century, and that we'll show you in part 2. Now, how did Christians access the scriptures? In other words, what did they use as a Bible? Well, first of all, the manuscripts themselves were very expensive and they were difficult to produce. There was no printing press. So because they were so expensive, the churches are the ones that basically kept those, unless someone was very wealthy. So for 1,000 years, remember now the Western Church didn't really use their Greek manuscripts if they had them. They used the Latin, and they did not guard the Greek manuscripts at all. So by around 1200 AD, people in the West began to speak different languages. There was Old English, German, etc. And so there was a desire growing for Bibles to be translated out of either Greek or Latin into those languages. For example, this Wycliffe, he translated from Latin into English during the 1300s. Then, after that, there were certain people that wanted to translate from the original Greek because that way you could go right to the source, and they had acquired knowledge of the Greek language. And so they wanted to translate right from the Greek. But there was no Greek New Testament that was recognized as a standard foundation that these translators could use. So they were hindered from doing their translation work. So the bottom line is that the translators needed a Greek New Testament that they could use to translate from. There was a growing need. Now, mainly people that the growing need was in for German or English scriptures. Now, the people that could do this translation work, if they wanted to, could travel to places that had these Greek manuscripts. But they would prefer to have their own Greek New Testament. You can imagine if you were doing this work, you'd rather have your own Greek New Testament. It just so happens that this was now possible, though, and affordable because of the printing press that had come into existence by around this time. Since it was in existence, the Greek New Testament, if it was produced as an original compiled work, it could be then printed economically and then translators anywhere could be using them. Now, there were certain men who had some knowledge of what manuscripts were already considered trustworthy by the by the Greek-speaking church. One of these men was named Erasmus. He obtained a few of these manuscripts and compiled a Greek New Testament, which included the chapter divisions that we use for the most part in our Bibles. His work became known as the Textus Receptus. And by the fourth edition of this work, there were also verse divisions. So it served as a foundation for translators from that point on who wanted to translate. It was printed and made available so translators could translate into the other languages. Now, how did people like Erasmus and those before him decide when manuscripts disagreed with each other? In other words, what wording do you use? They were faced with this problem, and this is the basic problem that faces us today. That's what this whole discussion is about here. So if one manuscript disagrees with another, which one is correct? Now, back then, the people believed that if there were more than one credible manuscript that agreed, then if there was a manuscript that disagreed, it was most likely incorrect. Keep in mind also, though, that back then, there was not much disagreement between the manuscripts that existed among those areas of the Greek-speaking church, Greek-speaking part of the world. These Byzantine manuscripts, there was not much disagreement with them anyway, so this whole issue was not as big of an issue to them in the first place. They believed that they were using trustworthy documents. They had strong confidence in them. So, when did people start questioning the majority that was obvious in the Byzantine manuscripts? Up until about 1850, scholars didn't question the credibility of the testimony of those manuscripts, which were considered already to be reliable by the Greek-speaking church. By the 1800s, though, some manuscripts had been discovered that we talked about already that were created before the 6th century. In other words, they were much older than the Byzantine manuscripts. As a result, a growing number of scholars were beginning to think that since these manuscripts are so much older, they simply had to be closer to the original writings. But there was a problem. These older manuscripts were full of variations between themselves, while the later Byzantine manuscripts had so much agreement with each other, which suggested that they were more reliable and pointing back to the original. Now, after about 50 years, though, a man named Hort came on the scene, and he developed a theory that would explain how there was so much agreement between the Byzantine manuscripts. So what is his theory? First of all, it's important to note that even Hort acknowledged that a majority of agreeing credible witnesses or manuscripts is the greatest evidence for the original wording. Listen to what he said. A theoretical presumption indeed remains that a majority of extant documents is more likely to represent a majority of ancestral documents at each stage of transmission than vice versa. So, based upon this commonly accepted principle, this is not just Hort's way of looking at it, the Byzantine manuscripts were obviously the best representatives of the original writings because all of these older manuscripts had lots and lots and lots of variations between themselves. Okay? So, because of this reality that these Byzantine manuscripts agreed so much, he put forth a theory concerning the Byzantine text form. He suggested that there must have been, in the first 3 centuries, some type of a major recension or revision that took place, that was ordered to bring the then known scriptures in agreement, so that many manuscripts would then be produced based upon the same original, yet it was purposely created back around the 3rd century. This sometime in the 3rd century. This was his theory that he put forth, because to him it was just impossible that it could be any other way, because these Byzantine manuscripts were in so much agreement. Humanly speaking, it's just too much agreement. Something had to have happened. So that's why he theorized this way. Yet now scholars disagree with Hort's theory. Today, most scholars view Hort's revision theory as flawed. They believe that the Byzantine text form actually dates back until at least the 2nd century, even though most of the Byzantine manuscripts date centuries later. Therefore, if we use Hort's own words, we really should give the Byzantine text the greatest weight as having the best probability of representing the autographs, because remember, he said a majority of extant documents is more likely to represent a majority of ancestral documents at each stage of transmission than vice versa. This is a commonly accepted principle. Today, you can purchase a variety of Greek New Testaments, but there are 3 essential camps, if you will, of Greek New Testaments. We talked earlier about the Textus Receptus. This is the one that was produced mainly by Erasmus a long time ago. You can still purchase that today. It was based upon the Byzantine text type, the Byzantine manuscripts, but they didn't have that many manuscripts to work with when they were putting that together. The one that I'm calling the critical text, this is the one that is put out by organizations like the United Bible Society, Nestles. They're based upon mainly Aleph and B. They give lip service, as I said earlier, to some of these older manuscripts, but it's really Aleph and B that they use most heavily and rely on. Then, and by the way, the critical text Greek New Testaments are the ones that are used primarily in these days by translators producing all the English Bibles. There is also what I'm calling a majority text Greek New Testament. Though these are come out more recently, within the past 3 decades. They continue along the path that Erasmus took by looking at the Byzantine manuscripts, where there was so much agreement. Those are the 3 categories, if you will, of Greek New Testaments that are available today. Okay, so how does that impact you as an English-speaking Christian? Well, the Textus Receptus, that was used by the New King James translators. It's also, by the way, what the King James is based upon. The critical text is the most common go-to for translators nowadays. So the NIV, New International Version, New American Standard, ESV, RSV, and many others, they're based upon this critical text. Up until very recently, there was no translation available in English of this majority text, but very recently one has come out. It's called The Sovereign Creator Has Spoken New Testament. But I should also mention that the New King James, even though it's based upon the Textus Receptus, in the notes, it indicates whenever its text deviates from the majority text. So the New King James does recognize the majority text, but it's just recognizing it in the notes. The actual wording of the New King James is based upon the Textus Receptus. So to recap, the Textus Receptus was basically produced by Erasmus. Around the fourth revision was produced by the mid-16th century. It used Greek manuscripts of the Byzantine class, although they did not have access to that many of them. And not only that, but Erasmus didn't even have any of the Greek manuscripts that contained all of the Book of Revelation. So he had to translate from the Latin into Greek to make up the last part of the Book of Revelation. Then there are the critical text camp Greek New Testaments put out by a variety of different organizations, Nestle, UBS, etc. The most important thing to note about these is how much these Greek New Testaments vary between themselves. So the translators of the different modern Bibles had a job cut out for them, because each of these Greek New Testaments said something a little different here and there, so they had to pick and choose, and thus the idea of eclectic, that word eclectic that was mentioned in the NIV preface. Pick and choose based upon what they thought was the best fit. So using human reasoning, that's how they dealt with it. Now, the majority text, there is Robson-Pierpont, Hodges-Farstad, and this one that I'm calling Pickering. That's Wilbur Pickering is the name of the man. He actually offers for free a PDF file. Again, there's links at the bottom of this page where you can actually obtain a copy of his Greek New Testament in PDF form. So the Robson-Pierpont one is the one I use for reading because it's available on Kindle. And it has some nice features that allow you to just touch the screen on any Greek word, and it will take you to a place where it's parsed for you. So maybe if I hold this up and then see, there's all of a sudden I touch the word and there's parsing. So that's why I like that Kindle version, because I can go and see parsing and come right back and start reading again. The most important thing to note about these various versions of what I'm calling the majority text is that they all pretty much are in agreement with each other, because there's far less disagreement between the Byzantine manuscripts to begin with. So it's not like the critical text Greek New Testaments that are available on the market, which vary so much between them. So let's review using a timeline approach now. By the way, we're virtually finished with this first half. That up until the 1850, people examined manuscripts for uniformity. So they're looking for agreement with each other to determine the identity of the text. So if there was agreement of a majority of credible manuscripts, they recognized that as pointing to the original documents. But starting with Hort, people began weighing the internal evidence of the manuscripts and applied human reasoning to each variance. Whenever they came across one where there was a disagreement between the manuscripts, they would apply human reasoning to try to deduce humanly what the original document might have said. So later, though, in the 20th century, there was a small movement of people, I'll call them the majority text camp. They returned to the approach that considers uniformity within credible manuscripts as the evidence that best points to the ultimate parent, which is the autographs. The majority text camp essentially follows the same path that Erasmus and others used before Hort came along. The only thing different is that they have access to many, many, many more manuscripts, which makes it gives them an advantage of finding the agreement and determining the text. Here's a timeline, time coming from left towards the right. So up until the time of Erasmus, again, I'm calling that the Textus Receptus camp, because there's still a lot of people that use the Textus Receptus. Up until him, they were using majority agreement to determine what the original text was. Then around 1850, Hort comes along and he gets off of that path and starts using, looking at internal evidence, he calls it, within each manuscript. When you see a variation, they would apply human reasoning to try to figure out, using various rules, what the original might have said. Whereas the majority camp, they're following along in the footsteps of the people that, like Erasmus and others, who believe that God had preserved the scriptures, and they're just looking for agreement between manuscripts that would give proof to what the original documents said. This concludes the historical portion of our story, and in part 2 we'll look at the evidence that speaks in favor of the majority text.